Welcome to this podcast by the Mixed Migration Center. In this interview, Bram Fraus, MMC's director, will be speaking about the asylum reception crisis at Ter Apel in the Netherlands. The first question is, has the asylum system in the Netherlands come to a halt, and why is the situation so bad at Ter Apel?
Well, yes, I think to some extent the asylum system in the Netherlands has indeed come to a halt. But I think it's important to stress that this should not be called an asylum crisis. It's a reception crisis, because in historical perspective, the numbers currently applying for asylum in the Netherlands are not that high. It's much lower than in the 90s or in 2015, and which is not what you may think when you see this footage, this shameful footage of the asylum reception center and the circumstances there in Ter Apel. But the situation is so bad because the reception capacity in the Netherlands is simply too low. But also because there are several other crises in the Netherlands at the moment, which in a way are all linked. There's the housing crisis. There's a huge shortage of houses. And that also affects the availability of houses for those who have been granted asylum. So currently there are about 16,000 people who have already been granted asylum. But they are still living in asylum centers across the country because there are no houses available for them. And now 16,000 is a relatively small number compared to the total number of new houses needed in the Netherlands. There are plans to build around 100,000 every year. But still, imagine those 16,000 people would actually find a house. We're talking at the moment about 700 people sleeping outside of the center in Ter Apel, several hundred more in very bad circumstances inside the center. But this could all be quite easily solved if there's way more space in the current asylum system. The housing crisis is also linked to two other crises currently affecting the Netherlands. First of all, there's the shortage of workers in almost every sector, including construction. So there's simply not enough laborers to build houses. But then there's also the nitrogen emission crisis. The government needs to reduce emission of nitrogen, and in order to be able to continue building houses, one of the sectors that will drastically need to cut down on nitrogen emission is agriculture. It's a very old problem, but again, the government and especially CDA and VVD have been pushing this file forward and forward until breaking point because they never really had the courage to really address it. And now there's been very fierce and violent farmer protests all over the country. And far-right populist parties have now managed to link all of this as part of a bigger conspiracy theory, saying the elite in the Netherlands wants more immigration, so they need the land of the farmers to build houses for immigrants. So therefore the Dutch farmers need to go and need to give up on agriculture. And of course that's a non-grounded conspiracy theory. But what is true is that several of these crises, the asylum reception crisis, the housing crisis, the nitrogen emission crisis, and the shortage of laborers all come together at the same time. They reinforce each other. And that during a time when there's a war going on in Europe, the cost of living keeps on rising with very high inflation. And that after 10 years of Mark Rutte as prime minister. So there's really a bit of a perfect storm brewing in the Netherlands with all these different crises reinforcing each other. And all of this makes this asylum reception crisis even more politically volatile. Also know that there's provincial elections coming up next year. And all of this is leading to the very shameful humanitarian circumstances we are now seeing in Ter Apel, where for the first time in history, MSF feels the need to implement a response inside the Netherlands. And as always in circumstances like this, it is in the end asylum seekers who bear the brunt of poor policies and lack of courage among political leaders.
To what extent is national politics affecting the Dutch asylum system? For example, this asylum application center is quite far away from central Netherlands and cities, and there are no direct train lines either. Has this been done on purpose?
Well, yes, national politics are definitely affecting the Dutch asylum system. All of this is the result of a deliberate policy. Indeed, the asylum application center in Ter Apel, where asylum seekers need to file their first application, is very far from where people would enter the country and hard to reach by public transport, and that's deliberate. And this policy is, of course, very similar to what we see elsewhere in Greece or in the European Union as a whole. And the idea is to make circumstances as bad as possible in the hope that this will discourage others to come. Even this morning, I read there is a Liberal Party politician saying that the Netherlands is still too attractive, as if that's a bad thing, if your country is an attractive place to go. And I think this kind of thinking is really the world upside down. And of course, this policy backfires. The Liberal Party of Prime Minister Rutte wants to appear tough on immigration, but what the consequences of their policy actually show is that they are not in control. Day in, day out, their voters are going to see what's happening in Ter Apel. There's a queue of people, terrible humanitarian circumstances. So they will think the numbers are massive, that the numbers are too high to manage, but that's not the case at all. And political competitors on the right side of the Prime Minister's party, of course, they use this. They say, see, this government is opening up its borders to record numbers of migrants and asylum seekers. As always and everywhere, people want to see that their leaders are in control of sensitive files like migration, but this situation in Ter Apel clearly signals that they are not. And if you would swiftly process claims in multiple locations across the country and then swiftly house and integrate people and let them work, hardly anyone would notice their presence. And basically that's exactly what happened with the Ukrainian refugees who came to the Netherlands. All experts have been saying for many years, keep a surplus reception capacity during times of lower arrivals to be prepared for higher numbers during other times. And it's not just so-called pro-migration and asylum activists who have been saying this. Consultants from PricewaterhouseCoopers advised the same thing. Keeping empty beds is cheaper than having to create new emergency capacity when needed. Plus, usually when you have to open up a new asylum center, there's resistance among the local populations and politicians, and it takes a while. There might be some protests. But once the center has been there and people actually interact with each other, they see that asylum seekers are just normal human beings like them, then resistance fades away. But all the hard-won support is then gone, because the government might close the center during times of low arrivals and then has to restart that same process again and again in other places across the country. So yes, all of this is a deliberate policy because conservative politicians like the Christian Democratic Party and the Prime Minister's Liberal Party, they think that if you have surplus capacity, that would be a pull factor for more asylum seekers to come, even though there's absolutely no evidence that would support this. And then you get to the point we see now where the national government is forcing some small municipalities to host relatively large numbers in places like empty hotels or office buildings. Like recently in a village of only 3,000 people, forcing them to host 300 asylum seekers. And that's like forcing a city like Rotterdam to host an extra 62,000 asylum seekers in one go. So to some extent, it's even understandable that villagers have concerns when something like that happens. And I think this type of policy, forcing municipalities to host asylum seekers, is never really going to work.
The situation in neighboring Belgium is also the same, with the asylum system struggling to cope with the administration procedures, leaving many people on the streets. If Rutte and the Belgian government had it their way, do they expect southern European countries to manage displaced people? Is this why the asylum systems up north are broken?
Well, I think there's indeed still a huge lack of solidarity across Europe, with every country hoping that other countries would receive asylum seekers and migrants instead of them. So yes, countries in the north definitely want countries on Europe's external borders in the south to host the majority, or countries in regions where displaced people actually come from. But that's actually what leads to this race to the bottom, and these shameful humanitarian circumstances in the Netherlands are a new low in this race to the bottom in a northern European country. But it's not just in the Netherlands, of course. We see this everywhere, unfortunately.
What do you expect as the Dutch government to do? Do you also expect an EU response to this?
Well, there are a couple of things the government can and should do. I think, first of all, listen to the experts who have been saying now for so many years to keep a surplus asylum reception capacity instead of scaling down every time the arrival numbers are lower. And keeping the surplus capacity is way more efficient, it's cheaper, it avoids crisis, and it ensures, in the end, also more support among the population. I think secondly, ensure that there are many small-scale asylum centers, not large ones, but small ones across the country. Because usually these small ones are well accepted after some time by local populations. And again, in these small ones, you can also keep that surplus capacity. I think third, make sure the asylum system as a whole functions more like the response to Ukrainian refugees that we've seen in the Netherlands, when there was actually a lot of willingness all over the country to host refugees. Many of them are working already because they're allowed to work. And there's a need for laborers all over the country in many sectors. Many of them will probably integrate very well if they decide to stay. Then I think fourth, make sure there are other locations more conveniently located where asylum seekers can file their first application so that they don't all have to go to the same place in a very remote corner up north in the country. Fifth, stop this procedure whereby people who arrive in light of family reunification also need to go to Ter Apel. There's really no need for that. They arrive through another type of process. They've been vetted already. But one of the plans now announced yesterday by the government to handle this crisis is to put a stop to family reunification in case of family already in the Netherlands who do not have a house yet, to avoid this congestion at Ter Apel. But this can be simply avoided by letting go of that obligation to go there in cases of family reunification. And then finally, there's the issue of available housing, which of course is a much bigger crisis, easier said than done to address, but also it is resulting from years of bad housing policy. But simply put, the Netherlands needs to ensure they're going to build more houses. But in the meantime, I'm sure more creative solutions can be found, like temporary, flexible housing, or using empty office buildings, of which there are many, especially now that so many people continued working from home, for example, after the COVID pandemic. And then in terms of an EU response, well, I'm afraid the EU has lost a lot of credibility on the topic of migration and asylum too. Only think of the continued support to the Libyan coast guards, intercepting refugees and migrants and then putting them back to detention and torture centers in Libya. So I think anything the EU might say on this issue might come across as a little bit dishonest. But that said, the EU should definitely strongly condemn what's happening and also critically assess the Dutch asylum policy, including the newly proposed ideas on family reunification, and then judge whether what's happening is in line or violates European legislation that the Netherlands should adhere to, like all other countries in Europe.
You mentioned the plans the Dutch government announced in response to this crisis. What do you think of these measures?
These plans are not really a solution, and some elements in it are highly problematic. The plan to basically suspend family reunification and then make it conditional on whether family already in the Netherlands who have been granted asylum have already found a place to live is extremely harsh on family members left behind. And it leads to longer-term separation of families and their children. And as far as I know, it's also not allowed by the European Family Reunification Directive. And it turned out the Dutch government is actually very well aware of this. So they are deliberately proposing something that is against the law. Reducing family reunification also signals numbers are the problem, but as I explained earlier, they are not. Another part of the plan is to temporarily suspend their part of the EU-Turkey deal, taking in refugees living in Turkey through resettlement. So here we have a country, a very wealthy country, having to deal with just over 20,000 asylum claims in 2022, and a few hundred people having to sleep outside the center. And in response, they say to a country hosting millions of refugees, sorry, we can't take any more refugees. What does that signal to Turkey or other countries around the world hosting much larger numbers of refugees? And how does it affect the credibility of the Netherlands and the ability of the Netherlands to have future discussions with countries like Turkey about refugee hosting? So these are all short-sighted ad hoc measures, not longer-term and real solutions that might even have a negative impact in the longer term, both for the Netherlands, but of course mostly for refugees themselves. And unfortunately, we keep seeing too much of such short-sighted policies all over Europe.
Thank you for your responses, Bram. This is the end of our podcast. I hope you found it interesting, and thank you for listening. To read the transcripts, please check out the article on our website, www.mixedmigration.org.